this flight was really about whether those processes could work. And it was about what happened when you tried to go back through the atmosphere to Earth, re-entry of this now 40,000 pound system, right? You've got a lot of weight there that you're going to be going back through the atmosphere with, see what that does. And it was a major milestone because everything did work, but it was still an unmanned mission, so you might not remember it even if you were around at the time. It wasn't as big a deal as all the manned missions. Well, that gets us to Apollo 5, which again was unmanned, launched in 1968, or early 1968. This time, it was internal designation, 205, I think. Anyway, they only needed Saturn 1B because this time they weren't really shaking down the whole rocket. They just wanted to do some things in orbit. Okay, and you can kind of see from the patch, maybe a little bit about what they're trying to do, because that's the Lunar Module, and they were trying to use the rockets on the Lunar Module to see if it was working. So they had to test that. And remember, the whole Lunar Module had to be invented for this project too. That was a big step right there, just inventing that whole system. But it had two stages, a descent stage and an ascent stage. And so those two stages both had to work in space. Everything had to be just fine. And this was the test. So this was the first lunar module that actually was launched on Apollo 5. And now Apollo 6, yet one more. Oh, wait a minute. Let me go back just a second there. You can kind of see in here the way the system was. The command module is basically this stuff forward, okay? It had a rocket that could actually do a fair amount, and it had fuel and things like that, and then it had the capsule on the top. This whole gantry at the top, that thing was an escape launch system. That would get jettisoned almost immediately after launch. That was only for if something bad happened right at the very beginning. And then down in here is where the lunar module would sit. And the way they had to approach that, you can see here, if the capsule needed to get to the lunar module, what did they have to do? Well, they had to separate, and then they had to turn around, and they had to come back and lock in with the lunar module. The tip of the cone had to come and be docked with the lunar module inside the stage, the rocket stage there. Big project, not so easy. So they got that to go. Apollo 6, yet one more unmanned one. April 4th, 1968, we're moving forward in time, as you might expect. This mission objectives were in part to demonstrate the structural and thermal integrity and compatibility of the launch vehicle and the spacecraft. Everything fits together and works. Confirm launch loads and dynamic characteristics. One of the things they kept talking about was when you light this rocket, it's a pretty massive explosion going on underneath you. And everything shakes on the way up. And there's dynamics of how much shaking can you take? What can happen? How much acceleration can you take? I mean, if you're going to put people in there, you can't push them too fast, right? You can't accelerate them too fast, or they're going to start running into real problems. So you have to think about exactly what you can and can't do before you try to put people on top of this bomb and explode it. Okay? But nonetheless, there was a lot of dynamics to think about. Okay? Demonstrate separation of the launch vehicle stages. That was an important part to it. If you're going to do a 3-stage rocket, you better have those stages separate before you try to light them again, because if they're still together and you set off the rocket, that's bad things are going to happen, no doubt. Okay? And then verify the operation of the Saturn V propulsion, guidance, control, electrical systems, all those kinds of things. It's important to note all of those objectives were achieved in this launch. But there were definitely problems with this launch. Okay? It had an early cutoff of the Stage 2 rocket, a failure of the engine to restart in space. Much of the mission was about separation of the stages, and so this was actually a pretty classic picture at the time. That was a really exciting picture to see that stage separate and fall away from the rocket. Okay, that was what was expected of the mission. Wasn't everything that happened in the mission. Okay, lunar injection. The patch talks about lunar injection. No, that wasn't what this mission was really about. It wasn't like they were going to the moon. You can see their lunar injection. If you want to call that the moon, they were not getting there. But they were making the orbit bigger because they also wanted to simulate the speed that you might have when you come back to Earth. So they had to test that. So this is just testing the heat shields and everything. They had to test everything multiple times. And so they had simulated a return from the moon with this one. It looks like maybe they were trying to go to the moon, but no. They were just simulating a return from the moon. And that worked. That worked just fine. So major parts of this flight were problematic. Nonetheless, if you remember the history or anything, you would remember that, no, this was a perfectly fine flight. Everything was good. Because that's kind of how it got presented to the public. But NASA had to write a 500-page report detailing all these various small things that happened, and they did it. This is in April. I think the report comes out in June. So they were working hard to figure out everything that went wrong. Right now, they had to fix things right now because the program was going forward. And guess what? The next Apollo program was a manned flight. The astronauts, of course, were celebrities at the time, and most of you probably don't remember any of those names. But nonetheless, they were celebrities at the time. Apollo 7 was launched on October 11th, 1968. It was designated AS-205, and since the number was 205, this was a Saturn 1B rocket. Okay. And because there was no intention of leaving Earth, you didn't have to have the Saturn V on there. But in this mission, the cabin was 60% oxygen, 40% nitrogen. And it was at a pressure of about 5 psi, which is about a third of air pressure at sea level. You would think you'd be in trouble with that little air pressure, but because it's 60% oxygen, it feels okay. It really isn't such a problem. Okay? And the hatch had been completely redesigned for the safety of the crew. Now it moved out, and but you had to be very careful about that too, because you don't want it to blow out when you don't want it to blow out. So there was a lot of concern. Okay? Nonetheless, it was now going to work. One of the big things that they wanted to simulate in this mission was extraction of the limb, the lunar module. So they were supposed to pull away from the stage, the second stage, and turn around and come back to the second stage, close to it. They didn't want to go all the way to it. They had a little glitch. In fact, you can kind of see the glitch on here. These doors that opened weren't quite working right, and it was described by one of the astronauts as an angry alligator. And so they didn't really want to go back inside that location right then. And fortunately, they didn't have to because there was no lunar module in this particular flight. There was just that, okay? But they wanted to show that they could rotate in space and get themselves pointed right in order to go get the lunar module if they had to. But they didn't have to this time. There were several firings of the command module, and in order to do these maneuvers in space, and the very first one, after a relatively smooth liftoff of the Saturn 1B, the blast from the service module, when the service module engine started, was jolting to the astronauts. And Shira yelled, "Yabba dabba doo," when it went off, in reference to Fred Flintstone at the time. The whole command module, though, performed superbly. They were very happy with everything. There was another minor problem. The windows tended to get fogged up and develop water between the panes of the glass. And so visibility was a problem for them a little bit, although they still did get some pictures of Earth that were kind of nice. They had trouble with heat dissipation in fuel cells. If you can't get the heat to dissipate properly in your fuel cells, you can't charge your batteries. Their batteries were not perfectly charged. They got over it. They had enough spare juice to get through the project, but it was a concern. They had the distinction of being the first astronauts to do a TV transmission from space. They had a 5.5-pound camera that they had sent up. There was a lot of controversy at NASA. Do we want to do TV from space? Do we not want to do TV from space? It was a big discussion at NASA, but here's another first. Another one of the steps. They had to do it, or they decided to do it. And it turned out to be a wonderful PR thing, because people were excited to see weightless astronauts moving in the environment of the capsule. They thought that was awesome. Well, yes and no. I've tried to look at some of that footage, and by today's standards, that was a horrendous camera. You have some video showing in a variety of places in the library here that I recommend going to see, but that is done with far better cameras than this first camera. It did not do a good job. But still, you know, you could tell they were humans. You could tell they were in some kind of special environment, that's for sure. But anyway, they took a lot of photos. They had a 10-day flight. One of the reasons for that was to prove that you could stay in space long enough to get to the moon and back. That was part of that. Okay, on splashdown, guess what? The module there turned upside down on splashdown, and it wasn't until the balloons inflated that it flipped back over. But for some period of time, the astronauts were kind of dangling from their seats. Didn't take too long to turn back over, though. So, and that's a picture of the Navy people getting ready to open the door and let them out. It was not them getting out and walking around or anything like that. Okay, now we get to Apollo 8. So this program, this flight had a number of firsts. Notice that it came soon after, December 21st, it came soon after Apollo 7. And this time they were going to get to the moon. This was at some level, this is the culmination of the space race, is it not? They got to the moon. Now, they were not going to land on the moon, but they were going to get to the moon. And there were obviously many steps. This is a schematic, but every one of these sections here says something about what they had to do on the process, on the way. It's interesting. I don't know, maybe it's too much physics, but the deal is, when you talk about orbits, they're elliptical orbits, so they're kind of, you know, egg-shaped orbits that you get, and how big the orbit depends on how fast you're going at any point in the orbit. okay? And it turns out that to get to the moon, you do a burn, you fire your engine somewhere over here, and you go around and you make this big ellipse. But if you do it right, as you approach the moon, you start to get caught by the moon's gravity, and you do an ellipse around the moon. It takes another burn before you're going to stay in the trajectory. And in fact, what you're doing is you're slowing yourself down rather than speeding yourself up when you do that. But anyway, bottom line is, and what that means is, from the time that burn happens until the time you get to the moon, Isaac Newton is directing everything you do. You don't have to do anything anymore for a long way. Now, that's not completely true. They had small adjustments to the navigation that they could do, but nonetheless, off to the moon you go. That's the general path. Obviously, there's a lot of things that have to happen, or you end up in space, or you end up on the moon, crashing into the moon. And so all those things had to go just right, and they did. And this one had a 6-day trip starting December 21st, and they included 20 hours of orbiting around the moon. So that was pretty exciting. So, okay, all went pretty smoothly. But, you know, this was confirming that the command module could operate in the moon environment. Whether, you know, maybe there was too much dust or something, or maybe there was something at the moon that was going to be a problem. They didn't really know for sure. They had to think about all these things, and so they wanted to send something up there and give it a try, see what happened. Well, this photo, that one, may be one of the more famous ones from the whole Apollo program. It's Earthrise, right? The Earth came up over the horizon of the moon for the astronauts, and they were impressed. They were also a little surprised by the beauty of the whole thing, and they scrambled for cameras to get pictures of this when it happened. But they did, they got some pictures, and I think they captured it pretty well on that one. If you saw the launch date being the 21st and 6 days, that means that they were out in space on Christmas Eve. They were at the moon. So obviously, maybe not obviously, but they did send a message back to Earth of greetings and peace and hope and all those things that you might expect from a transmission from the moon, the first transmission from the moon on Christmas Eve. That seems like almost obvious. If you recall any of it, you might even recall that part of this particular flight. But something else went across the expanse during that trip. And to me, it shows that these people may not have been quite as stodgy as engineers are kind of made out to be. They have quite a reputation, I think. But they shouldn't get credit for being outstanding writers, that's for sure. Let's have a listen.
A couple words for you, Jack.
I
want to get this LOI and the other keywords you want to give you. Typhoid Jack here, and we've got some good work here that originated at the Cape with a bunch of friends of yours. And it's sort of in a paraphrase of a poem that you're probably familiar with. You read me out the Holly? You're on the clear, Jack. Okay, it was the night before Christmas and way out in space. The Apollo 8 crew had just won the moon race. The headsets were hung by the consoles with care and hoped that Chris Kraft soon would be there. Frank Borman was nestled all snug in his bed, while visions of rest mats danced in his head. And Jim Lovell and his couch and Anders in the bay were racking their brains over a computer display. When out of the diskey there rose such a clatter, Frank sprang from his bed to see what was the matter. Away to the sextant he flew like a flash to make sure they weren't going to crash. The light on the breast of the moon's jagged crust astronaut gave a lustre of green cheese to the gray lunar dust. When what to his wondering eyes should appear but a Burma shave sign saying Gilroy was here. But Frank was no fool. He knew pretty quick that they had been first. This must be a trick. More rapid than rockets, his curses they came. He turned to his crewmen and called him a name. Now Lovell, now Anders. Now don't think I'd fall for that old joke you've written up on the wall. They spoke not a word but grinning like elves and laughed at their joke in spite of themselves. Frank sprang to his couch. To the ship gave a thrust, and away they all flew past the gray lunar dust. But we heard them explain as they flew around the moon, Merry Christmas to Earth. We'll be back there real soon. Great job, gang.
Good. One more.
Thank you very much. That's a very good point. But in order to win the race, you got to end up on the carriers. We'll see you there.
You got to end up on the carriers. So, actually, the video was what was going out over the TVs at the time. This was just an artist's rendition of what the module was doing at that time. It wasn't actually any video. But, okay, so Apollo 8 made it back, everything was good. We get to Apollo 9, launched March 3rd, 1969. Complete set of hardware that was supposed to go to the moon. So this was the complete rocket. Saturn V, Lunar Module, Command Module, everything, okay? And it had internal designation AS504, and so that's a Saturn V, Command Module, Lunar Module. This was just a test of the total system, though. It was planned for Earth orbit, and that's all it did. The kinds of things that were tested were lunar module extraction, docking in space, crew transfer from the command to the lunar module manned flight, an EVA from the lunar module even, lunar module docking back with the command module, and getting back down to Earth. All those things had to happen, and they had to happen just right, or we couldn't go to the moon. So you can see here, this does kind of show how small the actual space was. They didn't have a lot of room to move around. This was a chair, so the 3 chairs were lined up 1, 2, 3 right across, and 2 people sitting in the chairs, the third person might be able to move a little bit, but not very much. Well, they did manage to dock with the lunar module. That's the lunar module, and that's the command module up there. And they could do EVAs, and they could get back and forth between the two once they managed to get that docked. And the lunar module actually did fly. You can see it relative to the Earth there, but it was flying, and they could check the ascent and descent and all that. So it was a very successful mission, but again, only in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 was considered the final dress rehearsal. May 18th, 1969. By now, internal designation and whatever, they did everything except actually land on the moon. They made the trip to the moon, complicated set of rocket firings. They got to the moon, they did their orbits around the moon, they had the lunar module doing orbits around the moon with them, or without them, I mean separate. The lunar module got to within 50,000 feet of the moon's surface. They jettisoned the descent stage and fired the ascent stage. Everything worked just fine. They went back up, they docked with the command module, they did that schematic. The other 2 photos are the lunar module from the command module window and the command module from the lunar module. Okay, so that's what they had to dock with right there, and they were getting in, getting closer. Okay. We are set. It's now time to go to the moon. That's what Apollo 11 does, and that's not my talk. But I wanted to point out, my talk is Baby Steps to the Moon, and this is an abbreviated version of some of the steps that they had to take in the process of the Apollo program. There are a lot more things that had to be considered than this, a lot more. But as I discussed the Apollo missions, I've mentioned many of these stages, many of these steps. It's important to understand that on the time the Apollo 11 flight went, every single one of those steps had to work perfectly. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. There were not backup systems for many of the things that could happen, right? If the Lunar Module failed in any way, we strand people on the moon. If the command module failed, maybe we strand them out in space. There were a lot of ways that things could go wrong, and they all had to go right. And so that's why all these tests were done, so that we knew we could make everything go right every single time. And that's what the whole point was. That's why everything was so meticulous. There were a lot of Saturn V rockets that were launched in the course of the Apollo program, and not one of them failed on launch. That's an amazing thing. These rockets were truly huge, with a million moving parts, easily. And each and every one of those parts had to operate to specs in order for this all to work. And it did work. So now, as you approach the 50th anniversary of the moon landing on July 20th, I hope that you will understand that the astronauts were a part of a much bigger project with thousands of individuals participating in making it happen. And it took the commitment of the entire country to make it happen. But it did happen, and it's wonderful. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Did Apollo 8 actually do orbits around the moon?
Yes.
Okay. I couldn't remember that.
Yep. Yep.
So what would be your take on why, with all the advances we've made in so many things, why haven't we gone back to the moon since then?
It's a very expensive project. And I'm not the right person to ask this, but
Maybe it was cheaper in '68.
yeah, it was a lot cheaper. No, it was a very expensive project, and how much can you learn, really? Ultimately, the last several projects, or the last several trips to the moon, were basically about geology. There wasn't much left in terms of the astronauts figuring out new things to do, maybe figuring out how to survive on the moon a little bit was some of those other projects. But at some point, you're just going to collect some rocks, and that's really not worth it at some point. We've already got hundreds of pounds of rocks. So that's kind of why they turned it off a little bit. It makes sense to do a space station because much of the energy and cost and everything of going to another planet is just getting up to orbit of Earth. That 6 million pound rocket to get 40,000 pounds in orbit, that was what it was. It was 6 million pounds to get 40,000 pounds in orbit. Wow. That's an expense. That's a lot of waste, if you will. Once you get it into orbit, it takes much less to get it somewhere else. So a space station would really help that. And that's another reason to go back to the moon eventually too, because the moon is less gravity than Earth, so you can launch from there a little more easily maybe. Not a lot more easily, but a little more easily. Yeah.
I know some of the things I've been reading is that another reason why we stopped and same with the Soviets, space race is over.
Yeah.
And they saw no reason. It's like, hey, they're being to the moon, but there's no reason to continue.
Yep.
I have an additional question, really doesn't have anything to do with that, but I recently had the opportunity to watch First Man. I don't know if you've seen the movie or
I
not.
have missed that one so far.
But throughout the movie, when they talked about the Gemini flights, or at least that's how I've always heard them, they called them Gemini.
Really?
And I'm like, okay, have I missed something? Is there a reason that, is it just semantics? I don't know.
It was Gemini when I was a kid.
I know, but they kept saying Gemini, and I'm like, they're what?
So,
And then I'd see the word, and I'm like, that's Gemini, why are they saying Gemini?
Another Hollywood fabrication.
No, this time it's not.
Do you-
Virgil Grissom, he mispronounced it, and they kept it.
Really?
And in fact, he was the guy in Apollo 1, he's
Yeah,
one of
he
the
was-
people who
Yeah.
died.
Yeah,
And he
he's-
mispronounced
yeah, one of
it.
the ones that died.
That's
That's what this talked about too, is the three that died. And boy, that was a tough time in this movie. Yeah, so, okay, well, I was just curious if anyone knew the answer to that one, because I'm going, I don't know what Gemini is, but.
So it was mispronounced once and then it stuck for a movie? That's crazy. Yeah. That picture is taken by Neil Armstrong of Buzz coming down the steps. That's what that picture is.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. That's pretty cool.
So how can people say this never happened? I do not understand that.
I think, I don't know. I don't understand it either. It happened.
Yeah.
They're the same people who think the Earth is flat.
I was just gonna make a guess.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now, I'm
Steve,
sure
what's your take on the commercial space flight?
I think it's exciting, right? It has real potential for doing wonderful things for space.
He's gonna go on one.
Well, if you fund it. I would be happy to take that ride. Yeah. No, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. Clearly, a lot of the science has already been done for how to get into space. It's a matter of perfecting that little bit of engineering so that it isn't just a test flight every time. Make it a little more robust, and that's what they're trying to do. Yes.
Speaking of perfecting engineering, would you say that it's going to be like, I guess, what's your opinion on the commercial flights that are trying to be able to land on the way back? I don't know if you've seen SpaceX's videos. They have a bunch of, the rocket they'll get the rocket to start and it'll just fall over to the side. They're having trouble getting it to start.
Well, this is what I was saying about the amazing thing that the Apollo was, right? The Saturn rocket never failed. And it's so easy to make a rocket fail. So many rockets over the years have failed in such catastrophic ways. If you were to look up, do a Google of rocket failures, you get half an hour of amusement of watching these things do all kinds of amazing things. But essentially they're explosions happening on the launch pad, and that's bad. But yeah, so it's not so easy. It is not so easy at all. But you really do need to have it working like clockwork to do it as a commercial thing successfully. And that's going to take a lot of work. Yes?
I think I heard once, and I don't know if this is true, maybe Apollo 10, and I'm not sure if that's right either, but at some point they were really worried, one of these missions that went to the moon but was not supposed to land on the moon, they were worried the astronauts were going to try to go rogue and actually try to land.
Huh. These guys were pretty well trained.
Because everybody wanted to be the first person to land.
That's
or
true.
They didn't want to just...
Yeah, but they were pretty well trained. They were not going to do something that
I
wasn't
don't remember.
ordered, pretty much.
It seems like I have an idea of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I
I can't
It might have been the one
I can't
right before
remember the
11, I
details,
don't know.
I just remember something like that.
There was actually discussion with Apollo 7
It might be in your-
that they did break orders. They had a cold. One of them had a cold when they got up there. In fact, they all had a cold by the time it was over. It was a 10-day flight, right? And they all had colds by the time it was over, and their ears were blocked. And they were afraid to put on their helmets because they couldn't then repressurize the interior of their ears by blowing in their nose, right? And so they were afraid to do that and then go down into this high pressure atmosphere down below and have to take off their helmets and have their ears blow out. So they decided not to wear helmets, and Mission Control was not happy with them. You need to wear your helmets. They eventually relented and said, okay, don't wear your helmets, it's okay. But it wasn't like they had a choice. The astronauts were absolutely not going to wear their helmets, and that was a big deal. So yeah, they listened. It was fairly rare that an astronaut didn't do exactly what Mission Control told him to do. But it did happen. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.